Well, now we get to what's probably my least favorite tactic in the whole payables to profit system, and that is the one vendor negotiation. And I'll tell you in a minute why it is I don't really like it very much. But what a one vendor negotiation is when you're talking to your current vendor, somebody you're already buying something from, and you ask them for a concession. You ask them to lower their price. So let's talk about when it's the right tactic to use, and then we'll get into the expert guide and how you actually employ it. This is something that happens at the late stage of a purchase, right? It's something you're already buying something from a vendor, and you go to them and ask them about it. And I would use this for low impact, low dollar purchases, and low complexity purchases. The reason I say that is for the higher dollars, the higher impact, the higher complexity purchases, you probably want to invest more time, a little more money, and do a more robust sourcing process. This one vendor negotiation doesn't give you a lot of leverage, so it doesn't always get the best results. It can be still a thing to do if you have no other options and you're not going to take any action otherwise, but otherwise I'd reserve it for the lower impact, lower dollar, lower complexity purchases. And this is where you know who the vendor is, the leading vendor, because you're already buying it from that, and you're not thinking about switching vendors, you're just talking about getting a better price from that vendor. And the effort required is low, and so this is the saving grace of the one vendor negotiation. It is a low investment tactic. You can do it maybe in one conversation or 1 hour, but again, you can't expect quite the same results accordingly. So let's take a look at the expert guide and how you do this. And again, I've copied all my provisos here and warnings and cautions because I only recommend that you take on the one vendor negotiation when you've really concluded that you're not going to do anything else unless you do this. And when you've got good reason to know that the incumbent's pricing is not competitive. There needs to be a rationale. We'll get to that in more detail in just a second. But you don't have the resources, and again, this expense is relatively small, and it's not something that you can sort of bring some more effort to in terms of the sourcing process. So this is a tactic that's better than nothing, and good in some cases, and let's go into how you'd employ it. You want to, of course, define the project goals, and in most cases we're just talking about lowering the price, but you could be talking about, well, changing the deliverable, maybe increasing the quantity, increasing the quality in some way at the same price. And I want to ask you to go ahead and write down the reasons that you're not doing a stronger sourcing process. This is worth documenting for a couple of reasons, and one is, the most important is, sometimes you think, well, gosh, we don't really have the resources to do more on this, but once you write down why that is, you realize, well, that's not a good reason, and you decide to take another tactic. But you want a record of this, so write the reasons why you decided to do one vendor negotiation as opposed to another tactic. And now, this is important, you want to list the reasons that you think the current pricing is not competitive. You can't go to the vendor and just have no reason and say, give us lower pricing, gimme, right? That's an annoying thing, and without any context, it just doesn't make sense and doesn't lead to a good long-term relationship. So maybe you've heard from another colleague of yours at a different company that they're getting a much better deal on this with some other supplier. Maybe it's something where your prices have gone up recently, despite what you think should be lower costs on the vendor's part, and so that's your rationale. It could be something that's more on you in terms of tight resources for something or a budget cut in one area. I think that's not as good a reason, but that sometimes is the context. But there needs to be some story. This can't be just an open-ended conversation where you're saying, lower our prices, and there's no reason, there's no timing, there's no deadline. And yes, so once you understand those reasons, then you want to go ahead and draft the story. You'll probably only have one shot to have this conversation the right way, and you don't want to say it the wrong way. What's the wrong way? We'll get to that in just a second. But go ahead and draft up the reason, and we'll go through the components and a sample illustration of that reason in just a second here. And go ahead, after you've talked through that explanation or drafted it, you want to practice it. So review that with a colleague. If you're going to do it over the phone, practice it. Call up your colleague you're at your company over the phone and say, hey, this is what I'm going to say. You play the role of them, I'll play the role of us, and let's try this conversation, role play it, see how it goes. And again, by doing that, you want to just confirm your key talking points. Okay, this is an important conversation. So we'll get to the components of that in a second, but let's talk through what happens in the vendor negotiation. You want to log, of course, when you have the conversation, if you've communicated the key points as you'd intended, when the date was, and what their initial reaction was. Did they sound offended? Did they sound like they were expecting it? What happened when that first conversation happened? Whatever additional discussion notes you have there. And then always ask for a due date. Ask for a specific time when they're going to follow up. Don't leave this open-ended. Make sure that they have a schedule when they're going to get back to you. and then see what the response was. So they responded in writing. They need to sit in writing in some way. Was that appropriate? Was it enough? And you really need to decide if those changes were enough and you're going to accept it and move forward, in which case you'll track the savings and go forward. Or if it wasn't, in that case, if the vendor's response was not satisfactory, well then you should have some sort of action plan that should be in the next few months. It shouldn't linger forever. It might wait a month or two, but this quarter something should happen as a response to that vendor not responding to your request to give concessions and give lower prices. So let's jump now to a couple of important tips when you're having a one vendor negotiation. So I want to make these pretty strongly. You don't want to overpromise. You don't want to suggest that you're not going to take some certain action if you get this. And of course, if that's the case, then you can communicate that. But for example, I wouldn't want to say to a vendor, look, if you get to this price, we're not going to go out and do an RFP for a year. I wouldn't dare say that unless I knew it was absolutely true. And how would I really know it's true? So it's much better not to say that because you don't know the future. What you get almost as much benefit from, and is much easier to say, much more honest, is simply to say, look, if you make this concession, if you give us this lower pricing under these circumstances, it's going to look really good for you. We're going to be a lot happier. There'll be much less likelihood that we'll go out and have to do something in the marketplace soon. So it'll position you well. Can I make any promises? No, I can't, but this will work well for you. Now that statement, again, is much easier to say because it's true and it's not committal. So my strong admonition is don't go forward and say, yes, if you do this, we'll do this. Make it something where you're asking and maybe imply some concessions or some better positioning afterwards for the vendor, but don't promise. And the second note sort of goes along with that. It's assuming the best. If you go to a vendor and you say, hey, you guys have been overcharging us, or why are the rates so much higher than our competitors are paying? That's not going to bode well. That kind of puts them in a defensive position. You want to put this in a way where they have grace. If the goal is to keep the vendor and get a lower price, then you want a good relationship and you want them to have a graceful way out so they can say, yes, we are going to give you this, and they're going to look good in the process. But if you come in and say, hey, we're getting a bad deal, and you treated us wrongly by giving us these prices, then that's the tone that's probably not going to help you in the long term with that vendor. And as I mentioned this before, and when I said don't overpromise, don't bluff. Just be sure that you're asking with the right consequences in the right context. And if, for example, if you say, look, if you don't roll with these prices, then we're going to go to somebody else next month. Well, if that's really true, then maybe you can say that, although I question even then if it's going to be most helpful. But because you don't want to be really in a situation where you're blackmailing your vendors or sort of forcing them into things manipulatively. But it's much better just to say, hey, can you do this for us? It'll help you. Don't bluff. So here's an example of the one vendor negotiation. Conversation, excuse me. Okay, let's go back. Let's try that again. So here we are, and this is what you want to include when you're talking to the vendor and asking them for that concession. So I'm not going to read through the whole text, but we'll hit the components briefly and explain what they are. Obviously, you want to say hello. You want to give them the strategic context for why you're having this conversation. So again, you're not coming to them saying, hey, we want you to compete. We're going out to the marketplace. You're just saying, can you do something about this? And so what is the context? It's usually, well, we've seen the expenses in this area creep up, or we've seen that this is something that does not appear to be competitive, and it's gotten the attention of the higher-ups as something that we need to look at and where we need to save money. So you need to put them on notice that their costs have been seen and that some action may be taken because you're dissatisfied. If you can, you want to clarify and specify where that area is of the cost. If you can say, look, it's on this specific component, not on these others, then you want to say that. If it's, we feel like this is at least 20% too high, then you want to say that. And you may imply that imminent greater competitive tactic, for example, a full RFP. Don't say it unless you're going to do it, but if you simply say, look, I'm not sure what's going to happen, these prices as they are, we can't really work with that, it's not competitive, so if you're not able to work with us here, I don't know what's going to happen, but something's going to happen soon. That will leave the implication that it's going to be competed, you'll go to RFP or something like that. And you want them to understand that this is something where action is likely to follow. Then ask for the concession itself. Don't commit anything, as we already hit earlier, and give them that deadline, just like we talked about before.